If a tournament was held against the gods to decide the fate of humanity, which fighters would you select? The mightiest out of every nation, of course. And if you knew in advance that the first match would have you facing an especially strong divinity, what should be your immediate response? Picking the strongest man of all times. That is an evidence. This is the exact scenario that the first match in Record of Ragnarok showcases. A manga that I am planning a full recommendation video on, seeing as how inspiring and anabolic it is. The first champion of humanity, who will be putting his very soul on the line to preserve the lives of all those that inhabit the earth, also happens to be a perfect example of the type of larger-than-life characters the series focuses on representing. Making his entrance on horseback fully mummified, he would soon break out of his restraints, galvanized by the chants of his supporters. His insane vitality is immediately made evident by his ability to get out of what is essentially a reinforced straitjacket, yet a simple flexing of his muscles. The destruction of those leather strips symbolizing the freedom that this man's power confers him, a freedom that might very well help him slay a god. Presented as the strongest since the dawn of history, he is a brute amongst brutes, his disposition towards leadership resting entirely on his natural-born strength, that has earned him the respect of every soldier in his nation. The Three Kingdoms period, which sits at the heart of China's military past, has birthed many strong generals, but not one comes even close to him. The entire army would scream his name as one, unflinching in their belief that the mightiest warrior ranks in their numbers. Upon his entry during the Ragnarok tournament, he would hit the classic huge hero back pose, proving once and for all that he is the strongest creature on Earth in his universe. Not the most skilled, nor the most strategically gifted, but the strongest. The Japanese name of this man, who dominated battlefields with sheer strength alone, is Ryofu Huzen, but in his homeland of China, he would be known under a completely different moniker. Lu Bu, the Flying General. Having died of decapitation during his early life, his neck still shows the stigmata of the cruel blow. A reminder that the only thing that could take this man's life was an execution. This scar only adds to the intimidating presence that his physique commands, the Chinese general showcasing the typical body we can expect of someone who spent their life fighting. His torso and core are especially well built, giving even the gods a run for their money in terms of aesthetics, as Lu Bu's V-taper is the result of a crazily well-developed chest and serratus, along with incredibly deep lats insertions. These muscles, and the strength that comes with, have always allowed him to slay his opponents in one strike. It wouldn't be far-fetched to believe that he developed his body strictly via combat, making the only type of resistance training he ever subjected himself to the cleaving of enemies in half, along with the constant practice of his swings. Funnily enough, it makes total sense, the motion required to swing a halberd up and down perfectly mimicking that of a lat pull-down, while the movements required to slice left and right match those of standing Russian twists, which grow the core to a tremendous extent. Of course, when you decide to use these moves on a god, you can expect a little bit more challenge, but the simple fact that he was able to wound Thor as a mere human is already mind-boggling. Lu Bu is the perfect example of a man who was born strong. At age 5 or 6, he was already rummaging the steppe looking for things to kill, his favorite prey being wolves the size of his horse, that he would face only armed with a knife, causing the stupor of anyone who would witness such an improbable feat. The second he developed enough cognitive abilities to navigate the wood, he immediately decided that his goal would be to spread devastation and death wherever he went, and so set forth on his journey to become the strongest, before he even had a full set of teeth. he quickly graduated from wolves to bears, this time the size of an actual house, that he would take on with his bare fists. I don't know what Oside did to shonen authors, but between Grappler Baki and Record of Ragnarok, I'm starting to suspect that some grizzly or polar bear must have eaten a mangaka's dog at some point, because boy do they often serve as punching bags in this series. Of course, being the apex predator of most regions, they make for a great test of strength for the characters, and work well to power scale their fighting abilities. In this case, the pummeling of a 2-ton beast isn't even a challenge, Lubu giving a quarter to his furry foe and snapping his neck mercilessly. This quest to become the strongest will eventually reach its natural conclusion, when not a single being, either human or bestial, would stand in his way anymore. This means that upon reaching his prime, the flying general would be faced with nothing but void, as he had already conquered whatever could be, and defeated whoever stood in front of him. Some would be content to have achieved such an impressive goal. Not Lubu. To him, having no one to face anymore is pure agony, and while the concept of crying is foreign to him, the water running down his face is an accurate symbol of his sorrow. While he is not the expensive type, and scarcely speaks or emotes, the inner turmoil that the realization of his absolute supremacy creates within him is akin to that of a burning inferno, fueled by his constant thirst for adversity that this disappointing world has failed to fulfill. Existing in a black and white universe devoid of the colors of passion, he would stand atop a mountain made from the corpses he piled up to reach the summit, devoured by the frustration born from an appetite that can only be fulfilled by a special kind of prey, which he couldn't help but hunt to extinction. That was until Lubu met Thor. For the first time in his life, he is facing someone who not only blocks his attacks, but is also able to survive a direct slash to the chest, an event that hasn't occurred in the entirety of the Chinese general's life. It would take fighting a divinity for this anomaly of nature to finally meet his match, which aligns perfectly with the idea that he is the strongest man under the sky, considering the Ragnarok tournament takes place above the clouds. To complete his dream scenario, he received a god-tier weapon through the power of Volund, which allows him to fight full throttle without shattering his working tool. When you're facing a deity, it's not just an issue of matching their strength. You also need to account for the sturdiness of their weapons, which are also of a superior nature. And when that very weapon is Mjolnir, probably the most famous and powerful of all the divine artifacts, you got a big sprint to cover. And when an attack cannot be dodged, the impossible strength of Lubu allied with the mystical properties of Volund permit an undertaking so extravagant that it almost causes the shattering of our suspension of disbelief, which was already in a rough shape from the show's premise. It can block Thor's hammer. I say almost because this tour de force comes at a high price. To absorb the full might of Mjolnir is the equivalent of trying to prevent a volcanic eruption by covering up the crater with your hands. Even the monsters of heroic caliber who could rise to this challenge, such as Lubu, cannot expect to pull it off unscathed. Case in point, the stopping of Thor's hammer caused both of his tibias to snap on the spot, incapable of handling the sheer pressure exerted by a god wielding his favorite weapon. Most people would immediately faint from the pain, but Lubu is not most people. Not only did he not fall to the ground, which would be sort of expected in someone whose two legs just broke, but on top of that, he's actively trying to walk on them, oblivious to the fact that you're supposed to need functioning bones for that to be possible. When you set high standards for yourself, others take notice, and if they end up admiring you because of it, you can be damn sure that they'll be there to hold you accountable if you falter. China has pride, and it cannot stand seeing its hero down. Standing up isn't an option, it's a duty. The problem is that you kinda need intact limbs to be able to fight, especially when you're facing the god of thunder. Not saying that Lu Bu wouldn't be able to fight while crawling, but since the fate of humanity is resting on his shoulders, it'd be preferable if he put every chance on his side. Luckily, a Chinese general never travels without his horse, and so his loyal red hair was right around the corner, ready to become the legs he would need to continue this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to battle our creators. Fully aware that he was literally and figuratively on his last legs, Lu Bu elected to unleash his final move, a vertical slash making full use of his superhuman strength that he never once could use against an earthly opponent. This move uses a very specific grip that prevents the halberd from snapping in half, which is an absolute requirement considering that Lu Bu's grip strength combined with the intense centrifugal energy of his swings is enough to bend even an iron pole. That otherworldly power was developed after hundreds of hours of training, during which the general shadowed many a weapon, all in preparation for the day when he would finally meet an opponent that would force him to unleash his full potential. This one-track mind, born from a spirit fixated on strength, eventually led to the birth of the Sky Eater, a technique that utilizes the best leverage a halberd has to offer, at the price of making it incredibly hard to grab, increasing the torque of his movements and magnifying Lu Bu's already bestial power, to the point that the attack would even split the sky in two. And now, for the first time in his life, Lu Bu gets a chance to use that ridiculously overpowered move against an equally ridiculously overpowered opponent. Tensing every fiber of his body in anticipation for the clash to come, he once more makes a demonstration of the type of muscular density that only a lifetime of physical exertion could have packed on his frame. With a thick and freaky upper back, delts the size and shape of planets, and arms with more sweeps and veins than a topographic map. Basking in the memories of every single opponent that he had to defeat to get to this point, all of whom he slayed in one hit, this apex predator prepares himself to fully savor what he knows to be the one and only time where he will be able to use his full force during an attack, without having to worry about having his adversary just die on him. At this point, it's tough to tell who's the bad guy and who's the hero, since our would-be savior of humanity is essentially a shonen version of Genghis Khan, and has committed multiple atrocities in the name of his quest to become the strongest. Lu Bu, completely unconcerned with both his survival and the destiny of the earth, raises his arm to strike, setting up the movement with such intensity that he shatters the ribs of his horse by trying to anchor himself for the big swing, making that next attack the most devastating Sky Eater Lu Bu has ever delivered. How fitting for an attack that is destined to kill the gods to be called that, as if the general was aiming to devour their divine nature itself. Alas, trying to contend with divinities is not an easy task, and the hero of humanity had bit on more than he could chew. Not only did his attack not land, but the cataclysmic power of the blow also rebounded, which left his body mangled and unfit for battle. Anyone would have been able to tell that challenging Thor in a contest of might was a recipe for disaster, but to Lu Bu, considerations about safety aren't really a thing. Fighting strategically and securing a victory for the human race was worth less in his eyes than the opportunity to truly test his strength. And no one, not even his own body, will get in between him and his long-awaited trial. If an arm stops moving, then it just becomes a bother. Better to just bite it off and continue the fight unimpaired. Forget about back he would bit off one of his fingernails during the fight against the Yasha ape. Lu Bu literally chomped down on his own forearm and pulled the useless limb out like no big deal. That decision having taken absolutely no thought on his part whatsoever. It took the man with no rivals a confrontation with thunder itself to finally lose a fight, an event that he had been yearning for ever since he was a kid, as his dream to become the strongest eventually turned into wishing for a worthy adversary, one strong enough to take his life in battle despite him giving it his all. Real happiness was never found in the crushing of enemies. It was to be discovered during the most helpless of confrontations. While the odds are stacked against you and victory has become but a dim light, so faint that you can barely perceive it anymore. Rushing towards this light is what true joy is, because at the end of it is death, in line with the kind of destiny that any self-respecting warrior should seek. Not once did the thought of humanity's survival cross this man's mind, the only thing that mattered being his match to the death with the rival he had waited for his entire life. Having passed away happy, he would soon be followed in death by his army, for would the idea of an existence spent separated from their general is not even worth entertaining. As selfish as he was, this leader of men had enough charisma and strength that the very men who should have resented him for his failure to protect the human race decided instead to join him out of respect. Expedited by the hand of Thor, another Record of Ragnarok character that I'll be discussing soon in another episode of MANGA.